Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Lebanon has been pushed to the center of regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran since the Saudi-backed Lebanese politician Saad al-Hariri, in an unprecedented move, resigned his post as the country's prime minister, blaming Iran and its Lebanese-proxy Hezbollah of forcibly asserting Tehran's interests in Lebanon, as well as sowing strife across the Arab world. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, as well as Professor Efraim, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, and Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader yet more specific explanation with regard to the information.
For almost 7 years now, we have watched the so-called Arab Spring unfold and have wondered how come Lebanon, of all countries, the once most volatile Arab country, has kept its stability. It turns out that the laws of physics are still at work. What goes up must come down. And if you connect it with the new or renewed Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which has been energized by the rise of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, you get the amalgamation of these two trends, Lebanon again being shaken by internal forces, plus these two external forces at work.
Dr. Boms.
Well, Lebanon has not been that stable, not before the Arab Spring and not after the Arab Spring. And what we've seen now is an attempt to perhaps bring it back to an era of less stability, but really hammering on one of the most significant developments of this entire period, which is the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. One of the questions that became more significant, certainly following the last few years in Syria, the question of Hezbollah. Lebanon has been a country divided, and it has a militia that is getting stronger than the country itself. The balance of power between the different sects in Lebanon, and there are a good number of them, but three main ones, the Shias, the Christians, Maronites, and the Sunnis, is less stable, and the Saudis seems to have pulled the trigger and saying, look, we got to change some of this dynamic. We have to stop Iran and we have to stop Hezbollah.
Professor Kam?
I would suggest that the question is why now, after less than 1 year in his job? And I think there is twofold reason. One is the rivalry and struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in which there are two major battlefields. One is Yemen, the other one is Lebanon. And I think that Hariri came to the conclusion that despite his nomination as prime minister, he's losing the game. And he decided to, with the advice of the Saudis, he decided to retire. And secondly, the name of the game is Hezbollah. I think if we look at the situation in Syria and Hezbollah's role in this situation, Hezbollah is winning. It is paying a price in terms of many casualties, too many casualties perhaps, but after all it is becoming stronger in terms of political influence, in terms of military experience, and I think the Lebanese part of this game are very much concerned about.
Dr. Lerman?
Yeah, you cannot ignore the Shakespearean dimension here. Here is a man who took office in an arrangement with a Hezbollah-dominated presidency, while knowing full well that it is Hezbollah who assassinated his father. I can almost imagine him sort of in his mind going through the lines from Julius Caesar, that I'm meek and gentle with these murderers. There was, right from the beginning, probably a limit to his patience. But I agree with Professor Kamp. Clearly, the fall of IS, the collapse of the Islamic State, and the fact that the game of camps in the region is fast being reduced from a four-way battle to a 2.5-way battle, because the Saudis first sort of cornered the Qataris and coerced them into silence, and then they're moving onto the main arena to prevent Iran from exploiting the collapse of IS in order to position itself as the hegemon in the region. And the battle is in Lebanon, but certainly also in Yemen. The missile fired at the Riyadh airport is as relevant to Hariri's decision as developments in Lebanon itself.
Mr. Owen.
The Saudis, or at least the Saudi foreign minister, has blamed Hezbollah for the launching of this missile from Yemen. And he has depicted a grand conspiracy in which the Iranian spider is everywhere. But what used to be the banker of the Middle East, Lebanon, the sort of an Oriental Switzerland, where everyone else wants to keep it quiet in order for their money to be laundered through Beirut, this is no longer operative, because in the 1960s and 70s, up until the fall of the Shah was, in the American strategic view, supposed to be the guardian of the Gulf. And he was supposed to come in and save Saudi Arabia from the radicals if there was any coup attempt. Now, this changed, of course, when the Islamic Revolution took hold, and they started exporting the revolution, first and foremost, to the Shiite stronghold, namely Lebanon. And now Saudi Arabia and Iran are rivals. They haven't always been rivals, even though they both controlled most of the petroleum reserves, and therefore became subjects of interest to the United States when the Americans took over from the British the major role in the Gulf. Another point is that Lebanon is a country of political dynasties. The Jumails, the Shamuns, the Frangias, the Junblats, and one always remembers the story about Walid Junblat, who was told by Hafez Assad, another father of a dynasty, this time in neighboring Syria, he told him, you know, this is the seat where your late father, Kamal Junblat, sat before he set out on his last voyage, where he was assassinated by Assad's emissaries. So there are always veiled threats like that. And as Eran Lerman said, with Rafik Hariri's end, Saad Hariri knows full well the dangers of office.
Dr. Boms.
In the last few years, we've looked at this issue of proxy wars in the region. We've talked a lot about it when it comes to Syria, but we have to remember that in Lebanon, a lot of it had begun. What my colleague just said, Amir, the different sects also had different militias, each to his own, each supported by its own allies, by its own patrons. The balance of Lebanon was always an attempt to balance a very fragile set of interests and very fragile sets of powers. What Saad Hariri had attempted to do, was tasked to do, is try to balance and steer this into a certain direction. His patrons, the Saudis, became increasingly concerned because they thought that this balance of power is not working very well. He was working with the Iranians and with the Hezbollah and with his partners for the government and for the coalition, and some of that seems to have been a bit too much. And add to that this has been fairly dramatic because this is not something that he had said in Lebanon. He had to go out. We'll see if he will come back or not come back, announce this in a Saudi channel as to say, look, you know, the game is not really in my hands. And even given the perception that the game is really managed by somebody else, this is something that is becoming more similar in the Middle East. It's just like the fate of Syria is not in the hands of the Syrians, the fate of Lebanon is not in the hands of the Lebanese.
Professor Kam?
The basic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are basically are bad and tense for a long time. Yet from time to time, either Saudi Arabia or Iran is trying to find some kind of common background or compromise between the two parties. Just a few months ago, it happened. And there are indications that they might perhaps find some, I would say, compromise. It has not happened, and I don't think it's going to happen now, despite all the attempts, because the basic problems are not going to change. And because whatever is going to happen, probably Iran and Hezbollah are going to come out as a winner of this struggle in Syria, in addition to the Syrian regime. And I think even if some compromise would be found between the
Even with the latest developments which were brought forward by Saudi Arabia?
Even so, yes, I think so. And the problems are overcoming. I think even some compromise will be found. It's not going to change the basic situation.
Dr. Lerman?
I think the most significant element in this set of developments is actually the message from Washington, which for the first time was very coherently supportive of the Saudi strategy against Iran in an unambiguous and open way. Now, I would relate to this another development that people did not immediately connect, but the effort led by Secretary of State Tillerson to bring the Saudis and the Iraqi government together. In other words, to try and pull the most important element in the equation out of the Iranian column and over at least to a neutral position, if not more. And of course, the Saudis have the one thing that the Iraqis need, which is the resources to spend, which the Iranians are still quite stretched. The Saudis have less of a pocket than in the past, but it's still quite deep. And we have an American administration with all the question marks about consistency and the view from the top. But the two or three key players, Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, in different ways, I would say, are Saudi graduates. You cannot be the CEO of Exxon or the CNC of CENTCOM without being sort of Saudi-centered. 20 years ago in Israel, we would have been very worried about this kind of constellation in Washington. Today, because Israel and Saudi Arabia see eye to eye, facing the main challenges in the region, this is actually a welcome development.
To that end, are the Americans supportive of the Saudi strategy, or are they part of that strategy, Mr. Oren?
The Americans are quite supportive of the strategy, and it seems that President Trump has become emotionally involved with Saudi Arabia after he visited there and took part in that famous dance. He perhaps sees himself as the heir of President Roosevelt, who met with Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake in the Suez Canal. And he is definitely anti-Iranian and pro-Saudi. It remains to be seen what's the Lebanese derivative of this policy, because Lebanese politics has always operated in 6-year cycles. The president is being elected every 6 years, which is why the Marines have landed in 1958 and why the Syrians had to intervene in 1976 and the Israelis intervened in 1982 in order to have Bashir Gemayel elected president, but he was assassinated shortly thereafter by the Syrians, and so on and so forth. So Hariri only quite recently supported retired General Michel Aoun for president, even though Aoun was supported by Hezbollah. There are strange bedfellows there in Lebanon. The fact that he has gone unexpectedly to Riyadh and tendered his resignation in Riyadh, as if he submitted it to the Saudis rather than to his own people, speaks volumes.
Well, to that end, actually, when we're talking about Saudi Arabia, just several days before Saad al-Hariri announced his resignation, we heard Minister of Gulf Affairs, Minister Tamer Sabhan, who declared that the Hezbollah organization is a terrorist organization and whomever is supportive of it needs to be dealt with and punished. Dr. Boms, when we're hearing such a strong and definitive statement, could we already expect such a resignation from Saad al-Hariri and additional steps by Saudi Arabia in order to weaken the Iranian attempt to assert its control and its aspirations for regional dominance?
The resignation or the forced resignation of Saad al-Hariri and the Saudi move is interpreted as an attempt to eventually change the balance of power in Lebanon. If they will succeed, there are elections next year in May, and this is an opportunity to change the balance of power. Hezbollah is part and parcel of the government. Part of the problem that the Saudis have is that Hezbollah is becoming more embedded within the Lebanese system. Hezbollah is a political party. The Europeans don't even recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Just last week, we've had a delegation from the European Parliament that actually met the different political parties, including the general director of the Hezbollah political party of Lebanon, Sheikh Nasrallah. And for some people here, and certainly in Saudi Arabia or in the US, it may seem somewhat odd that this is the case, but this is the case. And what the Saudis are saying that needs to change, and therefore they need to stress who Hezbollah is. We've seen a recent report of generals from Europe and the United States also speak about Hezbollah, putting some additional light on the activities of Hezbollah. The Saudis are saying, well, there are Hezbollah experts in Yemen, again, sent by Iran. They're putting this entire axis together, and they're saying, look, this is Hezbollah, is Iran, this is the long arm of Iran, we are suffering directly from this terrorism, and therefore we need to act. This is the grand scheme of this, and they hope that this forced crisis will eventually bring Lebanon into a different political power. They may, as Professor Kam said, will fail. It could be that the political circumstances will not change the situation significantly. It's not even clear how it will change because the resignation is not yet accepted, and with the prime ministers outside of the country, it is also a bit difficult to see how the events will unfold.
Nevertheless, Professor Kam, we heard the same Minister Tamer El-Sabkhan talking on the Al Arabiya network, declaring that the Lebanese government is at war with Saudi Arabia, specifically because it allows a terrorist organization, perceived so by the Arab Council of the Gulf, to be part of this government makeup. How do you see this actually challenge for Lebanon and now also the Islamic Republic of Iran, which for such a long time, especially in the successful endeavors in its battle against the Islamic State, where it received such a positive perception in Lebanon, now to shift its attitude from losing its support from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region?
First of all, the Saudis started to punish the Lebanese, to punish the Lebanese government even before that. They cut military assistance to the Lebanese armed forces last year.
$4 billion.
Which is very
French
significant.
deal, yes.
We don't get $4 billion from the Americans. It's a huge assistance for them. And they decide to cut it because they want to punish it, because they want to tell them what is more important for them. What they're going to do now, I don't know. Perhaps all the negotiations will start again as it did last year. If an agreement will be found or achieved, I don't know. I would add to this picture what's happening in Syria, because what happened in Syria is affecting the situation in Lebanon. And looking at Syria, I would suggest that the Iranians are not going to leave Syria for a long time. They want to stay there for years, if possible. Hezbollah might stay in Syria as long as it is allowed to do it. Hezbollah, as I say, is going to be stronger. If this corridor between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon will work, Hezbollah will get more weapons, more sophisticated weapons, in addition to those weapons coming from those plans that Syria has established for Hezbollah, both in Syria and in Lebanon. So Hezbollah is going to be a much stronger organization with war experience in Syria. And this should be a matter of great concern for all those who oppose Iran and Hezbollah.
Dr. Lerman?
I will just qualify this by saying that if Hezbollah thinks that their experience fighting ragtag rebels in Syria makes them more capable in a war with Israel, they are stupider than we actually think. And I don't think they are. I think they know full well that they cannot really draw parallels between these two. So, and I think the power of deterrence going back to 2006 is still quite significant. Having said so, they may find themselves cornered in the new Lebanese situation, and we are sailing into uncharted waters with the U.S. policy against Iran, Saudi policy against Iraq, instability in Lebanon itself, a shifting situation in Syria. We need to be very clear in our own deterrent profile to make sure that the Russians, for example, make it very clear to Assad that it would be very stupid for him to take risks going all the way over to the Iranian side of the equation.
Well, to that end, actually, I'd like to touch base on a statement by the top advisor of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who visited both Lebanon and Syria, during which he did declare that the next step of the Syrian government specifically, together with Hezbollah and Iranian backing, is to recapture the city of Raqqa from U.S.-backed forces, specifically the Syrian Democratic Forces, predominantly Kurdish. Do you think that this move, where for the first time the Islamic Republic is talking about the frontal confrontation with U.S.-backed forces, is significant also for Lebanon, also for Israel, and also for Saudi Arabia?
If it is not an empty declaration, it signals a very bad turn of events for Syria because just the moment after the coalition has managed to occupy Raqqa and notch quite a victory over ISIS, for the erstwhile allies to start fighting among each other, which they did almost everywhere else, including in Iraq, in Mosul, and now in Kirkuk, and many other places. Perhaps this would push the United States into a stronger involvement in Syria, because there are various forces within the Trump administration. There are people calling for getting out, extricating the United States out of Syria once the fight with the Islamic State is over. And there are others who call for retrenching there, putting boots on the ground for whoever knows how long. And this ties in with your earlier question regarding Saudi Arabia, because what we are seeing now is a new proactive policy by the Saudi rulers, especially Mohammed bin Salman. We haven't seen such a flurry of activity, perhaps ever. This new blockade of Yemen, which just a few days ago started following the missile being launched at Riyadh. Earlier, the fights against Qatar, and other moves on the diplomatic, financial, and security fronts. This is quite a shift, because Saudi Arabia was always known as a financial giant, but a military midget. It always had to be helped by others, such as Egypt under Sadat, earlier against Egypt under Nasser. Now it's a new chapter in the Saudi policy vis-a-vis the region, and we are seeing Israel aligning itself with this Saudi regime and Saudi policy, because it now has two common rivals, Iran and Hezbollah.
Pointing to something that Dr. Lerman has said, Dr. Boms, when we're talking about the Russians, would they be able to allow the Iranians to do whatever they want, especially when we're talking about hurting the diplomacy that has been worked so hard for, specifically the deconflicting cooperation or coordination with the United States when it comes to Syria as well as elsewhere, that impacts to one degree or another the situation in Syria where Russia has significant stakes in?
Well, the Russians and the Iranian interests are not always aligned. They're not always aligned in Syria, and I think they're even less aligned in Lebanon. Russia, and we've discussed this here before, have its own interests, its own economic interests, and interests of regional hegemony. It also wants to make sure that it will remain, and that's certainly in contrast to the Americans, the leader, the wheeler and dealer in the region. If the Iranians are trying to do that with their own troops, and then if the Saudis, and then by proxy the Americans are doing this, that's certainly not aligned with what the Russians are doing. So the Russians have not yet said the last word on this, and the Russians would probably want to make sure that they will have influence and access to this situation. But it seems that the Russians are actually busier in Syria because they have more specific interests there. In Lebanon, they probably can afford for some of the other rivals to fight amongst each other, while they're continuing to pursue what is for them is more important strategic interest in the Syrian arena.
Professor Kam, I'd like to bring Israel into the picture once more. How do you perceive Israel to be in the midst of all of this? Of course, we hear about Israeli interests to align with the Saudi regime, but at the same time, there are plenty of challenges up ahead.
I think Israel would like very much to cooperate with Saudis quietly under the table. But at the same time, I don't think that Israel will change its policy of not intervening as much as it is possible in the fighting in Syria and what happens in Syria. Israel wants to stay outside of this game.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lerman, would you agree with that?
I would qualify this. We just saw this week, for the first time, Israel crossing, at least rhetorically, the line and saying there will be an local intervention, actually on the side of the pro-regime forces in the village of Hada for very local reasons, for legitimate concerns of the Druze community in Israel. But it is also an indication that we are no longer quite as, let's say, insulated from the Syrian situation. The main thrust of the message, coming from Defense Minister Lieberman and others, has been that if Iran actually ends up being the master, we would act forcibly to prevent this from happening. This is a message for Putin. Mm-hmm. Look, your client Assad, whom you saved from the gallows, may lose everything. And you would lose much of what came with your investment in his survival if he puts his head into the meat grinder serving Iranian interests. It's brutal, but it's pointed, and it's designed to prevent the kind of developments that would force our hand down the road.
Mr. Oren?
Well, these are strong words, Eran Lerman's and Avigdor Lieberman's, but the Israeli public has very little taste for another adventure either in Lebanon or in Syria, and especially as the end state is not known, and the Israelis have become quite accustomed to periods of quiet. There's no longer any need or reason to preempt. There's nothing to preempt. They are there already. If you start a war of choice, the Israeli political echelon is always fearful of a commission of inquiry following the end of the campaign. And one has to go back to Putin. Even a medium-sized country like Great Britain has a prime minister who is not Mother Teresa, but Theresa May. With Putin, what we have, to borrow from another neighboring culture, Vlad the Impaler. He is not going to be very sensitive to Iranian views or to Turkish views or anyone else's. He is not in the business of charity. Whatever Russian interests dictate, he will do, even if it is against Iran.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Dr. Boms, we'll start with you.
Part of the problem of this issue is that when you collect stamps or when you collect missiles, at some point you may have a chance to bring them to the table. What we've been seeing in the last few years, certainly in Lebanon, is one particular group, Hezbollah, collecting missiles, collecting weapons, collecting experience on how to use them. This particular development may bring us one step forward closer to the chance of somebody using them.
Professor Khan?
I think that Iran has no interest now to go into some kind of military confrontation with Israel. The main interest is now to strengthen the position in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and any confrontation with Israel might undermine all these efforts.
Dr. Lerman?
I totally agree. At the same time, we have to bear in mind that the Saudi escalation against Iran is changing the nature of the game. We are sailing into uncharted waters. And if the American administration has really committed itself to support the Saudis on this may change the regional balance.
Mr. Oren, also in Lebanon?
Yes, deterrence is a double-edged sword. The Israelis have deterred Hezbollah, but they have been deterred from trying to preempt the Hezbollah missile arsenal. If they get more accurate, more precise weapons, we will see some escalation.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Boms, Mr. Oren, Professor Kam, and Dr. Lerman for coming here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.